Hi, my name is Josh White, and this is Globalists, the new podcast from the battleground. This week, the United States is marking its 250th year of existence. Americans are naturally celebrating, but how does the rest of the world see 2.5 centuries of the United States? What has it brought to the world, for better or worse? What is its role now, and what is its future? Joining me to discuss these wide-ranging questions is my co-host, Mitchell Plitnick.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, as we're approaching, July 4th, I have to say I'm of the generation that can still remember the bicentennial, the 200th in 1976. And there was, quite frankly, a much more, despite the fact that, this was right in the wake of Vietnam, there was a much more celebratory atmosphere 50 years ago than there is now. I think, the despite the feeling of defeat that came out of Vietnam, I think a lot of Americans still felt relatively optimistic about the country, and I don't think they do today to anything like the same as saying. I think there's a lot more cynicism. But, at 250, which is, we have to remember here in the US, that's very young for a country. But and we don't really have a lot of history, which is one of the, I think, drawbacks of the United States and our perspective looking out on the world. That prompts kind of a, sort of a look back and see what has been the mark of the United States. And, it's easy, I think, especially for those of us on the left, it's easy for us to look at all the negative things about the United States, and there are quite a lot of them. And I'm going to run those down as well. But I think also, to me, there's the legacy of the first 250 years of the United States is one of unbelievable, massive crime, and also of real missed opportunity, despite all of those crimes. It is, the United States has a self-awareness about itself that is very myopic, the way we see ourselves. And while on the one hand, I think most Americans, except for, some of the really extreme nationalists, do understand that the United States is a country that was born in genocide and was built by slavery and has a legacy of racism. Even conservatives who would argue that we've overcome that legacy, which is, of course, nonsense, even they realize that that's what the history is. I think most. But despite that, I think one of, to me, the great tragedies of the United States is actually the post-World War II era, which is in many ways just ending right now, because that era gave the United States a real opportunity to fulfill the promise it thinks it has as a revolutionary country. We still talk about the American Revolution as if this was a truly revolutionary thing. That mythos was something that we could have made reality after World War II. And there were those of us that tried. I think there were those Americans who really thought that it was time to create a world where, there were international institutions that guarded human rights and that made sure that, global warfare was curbed. I think there's there was some major failings in there. One was that I think they prioritized maintaining capitalism over maintaining that sort of justice. But we can talk about why that opportunity was missed, and there's many reasons for it, and most of them are pretty shameful. But there was an opportunity. It was an opportunity that I think was unique in many ways to the United States historically, just because of the time, the fact that there was a globe that could all really interact on a global scale. There was the push towards decolonization was happening in the wake of World War II. There were things that if we wanted to be on the side of justice, we had as I say, unique opportunity to take advantage of, and we completely blew it. And I think that's the greatest tragedy of the United States. And now that the empire is in decline, We're talking about a global military hegemon that's still unrivaled in terms of our military power. What we can get done with that is a different matter, as we're seeing in Iran. But we have the power to do enormous destruction, and that also is historically unprecedented. It's kind of a scary thought when you think about, when the British Empire went into decline, it just did not have this kind of potential as it went out kicking and screaming to destroy so much around it, and the United States does. And I think we need to really think about that. And so those are the biggest thoughts I have at American 250, and they're not particularly happy ones, and they're not particularly, they're certainly not celebratory.
I hear you. And I, of course, speak from London as a Brit who's always kind of looked on with fascination at the United States, as many British people do. Although, I have to be honest, the British and the Europeans look on with fascination, but also a mixture of horror and excitement and confusion at what the Americans are doing. And that's probably true across the board politically at different times. And something that comes to mind for me is how the kind of perception of the US has always kind of varied politically, even though there are those kind of moments where right wingers are seemingly freaked out or angry with the United States for various reasons. They're usually the people who are trying to live vicariously through US imperialism, especially in Britain, where the so-called Atlanticists, fancy word for just, I suppose, pseudo neocon or kind of liberal interventionist types, really, who fancy themselves as some sort of junior partner in the US empire. A role that is rarely given any credence, if at all, on the other side of the pond, from what I can tell. The special relationship is very much a one-side phenomena. Meanwhile, the Europeans, the continental Europeans, I should be more specific, the French in particular, have seen themselves defined against the US in many ways. And this is largely a linguistic phenomena, but it's also a historical phenomena of departure. The French have kind of defined themselves in their imperial decline against the United States, whereas Britain in its imperial decline has tried to live through the US, I think. And this is still very evident today, even with the UK kind of avoiding participating in supporting the Iran war, albeit half-heartedly. God knows if Starmer had the capacity to get involved, he probably would. Meanwhile, the left of British politics, the real left, because Labour is a joke, of course, crippled by neoliberalism and before that, social democratic compromises of US imperialism, to be fair. The radical left has had a long, interesting relationship with the US and Britain, whether it be the early days of, say, William Blake cheering on American independence, of course, Thomas Paine, so on, one of our more humane exports to North America, one of few probably, through to people like Marx and Engels who are cheering on Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, and then that carries on through to the 60s, really, and to the present situation where the fact that we are in the Anglosphere, we are the Anglosphere, Britain and America, we tend to pay far too much attention to each other. Putting it mildly.
In some ways, I think it might be a blessing that we here in the United States aren't paying attention to more people. If the sort of blind obeisance that we get from most British prime ministers, I would say, would be replicated elsewhere would not be helpful. I would argue. I think it's when we think about the left and the American left, what we think of as an American left, there's actually very little truly radical left movements here. There are those of us on who are certainly on the radical left in various ways. But what we call left, what we call radical here in the U.S., I mean, is centrist in much of the world. Some of Bernie Sanders or people in the political sphere, even someone like Zoran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialists of America, their policies are not particularly radical. Um, they're they're certainly legitimately left, but they're not sort of a far left. And I think that this is part of the problem that the United States has with the way we perceive ourselves in the world. And it reflects back in the way I think, and at least the way it feels to me, that the world perceives us. The world in general has I don't, we often hear here in the United States how people might not like our government, but they like our people. Well, they don't particularly love our people either, I don't think. I think what they like is the fact that we have enough money to be, lavish tourists and help other people's economies thereby. And it misses the point that the reason that so many economies in this world are so dependent on tourism is this sort of the brand of capitalism that the United States has pursued and has enforced around the world, and the amount of poverty that creates. That is something that the U.S. does not want to grapple with, and this is reflected, and it's reflected elsewhere. We're not the only ones that are like this. Is certainly reflected in Britain as well, with the response in both countries to migration. We resent people from Africa, from Latin America, from the Middle East, who are coming here to try and find a better life or to escape, literally desperate circumstances, war, starvation in their own countries. Well, what has that been caused by? Largely by Western foreign policy, not exclusively, for sure. There are other factors, but we have a foreign policy that is miserly at best, and is very greedy. I think, I alluded before to the sort of post-World War II institution building, which the United States ended up funding most of, and yet at the same time, as much as the United States, we would look at it, well, we're funding X percent of this and X percent of that, and yet we look at our foreign aid spending, and it's among the lowest in the world in terms of percentage of GDP. And what we do spend and the efforts we do make internationally are begrudged by a large portion of our population. To me, that's a lot of what the legacy of the United States will be when it's, when the empire has finally crumbled. It will be a legacy of greed, of self-deception, not recognizing, when you say to an American, well, we spend whatever, $10 billion on foreign aid. I'm just throwing a number out. It has no bearing on reality. And it sounds to them like a lot of money. Give me $10 billion. Look how happy I would be. But in reality, it's nothing. And compared to our GDP, it's literally invisible. That sense of perspective is something that doesn't really exist here in the U.S. And of course, in plenty of other places as well. The problem is that it really impacts our Republican kind of politics and affects policy in a very, very big way that can only be maintained through the lack of real education that most Americans suffer from.
Yeah, when I think about this, I often wonder what American imperial decline will look like long term, because of course, from a British perspective, we've had our decline for well over 100 years. I mean, it arguably begins in the 1880s, if not a bit earlier. So it's been playing out for us for a very long time, and the empire is long gone at this point, but the kind of declinism is still very much with us, and the kind of political and cultural ramifications of that are huge, and our politics still hasn't recovered from it. We're still in denial, and we're still kind of throwing up these kind of strange nationalist experiments, whether it be Brexit or it's all this talk of mass deportations or you name it. And in a way, Trump is kind of a preemptive uh, preemptive figure of this kind of imperial breakup in many ways, in that he's, for lack of a more sanitary metaphor, he's throwing up the nationalist experiment before the imperial breakup actually happens.
I think it's an interesting point because Trump, in many ways, I think for the United States, represents kind of a zenith of our decline. Not just the anti-intellectualism that he represents, which is, I think, a very big deal. The kickback against the idea of experts, the idea he was elected, and many of the people who still support him in their cult-like way love him precisely because they think he's not a politician. He's actually a consummate politician, but he runs on the idea that he is an outsider, that he was going to drain the swamp, and of course, none of that's true. But the idea that we want somebody who's not and of course, this is wrong. This is entirely wrong-headed thinking. Somebody who's not a politician doesn't know how to do the job. You can have bad, even just in framing it in capitalist terms, you can have a bad CEO who does, who brings the company in directions you don't like, but does it correctly. Does it, you can have a CEO, Jeff Bezos, does terrible things if we look at it from a certain perspective, from the perspective, for example, of his employees. But if we're looking for somebody who's going to enrich shareholders, he's doing exactly what they want. In some ways, one could say that about Trump, but in many ways, you can't. In many ways, he has not even been that. He has shown rank incompetence, and there is a difference between somebody who's doing things you don't want them to do and somebody who doesn't know what the hell he's doing in the first place. So, and I think that in many ways that is indicative of the end of an American project that has gone to a great many extremes in its time. I mean, one of the issues we talk about, settler colonialism all the time. There are certainly examples just as onerous in history, and Britain, Belgium, France, many countries have are examples of it, of just brutal settler colonialism. The United States, though, is among the most extreme. And when you think about the ongoing legacy of it, the fact that our indigenous people still live on places called reservations, are still so incredibly marginalized. Even while liberals like to make a big talking point of respecting indigenous culture, which is, we don't. As a society, many individuals do, but we as a society do not at all. We can talk about slavery, which is, again, a shameful legacy that many countries, many white countries, were involved with in one way or another. But the extreme version, the United States was the only country that of all slaveholding countries, the U.S. was the only one that explicitly defined slaves as property and gave them no rights whatsoever at all. That you could literally, just kill a slave because you felt like it, and you were entitled to do that. Other countries actually did have laws against that, at least that level of barbarity. Hardly a mark in their favor, but it says something about how the United States treats these issues. And you look at, just post Civil War, and how determined we were to allow Reconstruction to end. And these things are structural. I think that's, I guess, really the point I'm trying to get at here is if you look back at our Constitution, you look back at all of the, we have a wonderful, rich record of the constitutional debates. Many of them were published even at the time. Many of them were just preserved. We see what they were all talking about. And what they were talking about is what was the best way to avoid democracy. What was the best way to give certain people power in the government, but not have it actually be given to the masses. because the masses, in their view, could not be trusted. And they're, in a sense, right. They couldn't be trusted to look after the interests that these guys, the landholders and the wealthy, thought were the most important. And we live with that today. We live with it in the structures that we refuse to challenge, or we're just not capable of challenging. Most prominently, I think, the structure of our Congress, where we have the Senate, which is an incredibly powerful body, where every state of the 50 has 2 senators. So, the representation, this has been discussed many times, the representation for people in Montana that have, a state that has less than 1 million people, is the same as the representation of states like Texas and California and New York, which have tens of millions. That's not an accident. None of this is an accident. It's not, and it continues to this day. Yesterday, I guess this morning, the Supreme Court widened the ability to spend tons of, for campaigns and corporations and PACs to directly coordinate with candidates about how they're going to spend millions of dollars that we have basically removed all restrictions from in terms of political spending. So it's ongoing, and it's continuing, and it's evolving, I think, and it is not evolving in a democratic fashion. And that's why you're seeing, I think, finally, it took way too long, but you're seeing finally working people in the United States and middle-class people in the United States are waking up to the fact that this sort of moderate center, whether that be the Democrats or the sort of squishy, never Trump type Republicans, that so-called moderate center has no answers. I think people have finally realized that, because what they're doing is defending a status quo that was constructed to prevent democracy and to prevent justice and to prevent fairness. And really, it's to promote the power of laissez-faire capitalism, a brand of laissez-faire capitalism that is so extreme that I think somebody like Adam Smith would look at it now and just say, whoa, I had no idea we were going here. This is not what I had in mind. And just would, just would never stop throwing up.
No, definitely. Adam Smith, as a good Scottish Protestant, would have been pretty horrified, especially as his economic and political project was supposed to be matched with a pretty strong ethics that would have, in his theory, guarded against many of the more shocking aspects of American capitalism.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have got something like the kind of the phenomenon of, say, the Tenderloin district in San Francisco that friends of mine stumbled upon while they were over there, and the horror.
I used to live there. I can tell you, it's an interesting place.
Yeah, of poor people, desperately poor people, mentally ill people, drug addicts, all being shoved into this one area and basically being kind of ignored and marginalized, and God forbid they come out of that area and encounter the police.
Yeah.
The Smith philosophy was very much about compassion, believe it or not.
And it's actually a really interesting example. The Tenderloin in San Francisco, as I say, I used to live there, and it is situated literally right next to the downtown area. It's just right there. You can walk to where people have offices that are very lavish and are making all kinds of money, and it's right near. It borders where the famous San Francisco cable car turns around on Powell and Market Streets. It's right in the middle of the city, and yet it is this. It's not like there's a wall around it, and yet it's ghettoized. People stay in there. There is an atmosphere there that just loads people into this one horrible area. And of course, there are now other depressed areas in San Francisco. It's not the only one, but I think its particular location always struck me because it was so close to the business district, where all of these offices are, it says, I think, it says a great deal about how the United States has faltered. And these things are going to get worse. I think one of the things that we're going to inevitably see in the United States is a push towards even greater impoverishment of the masses. We're seeing that in the, and this is a global issue, of course. But I think as it becomes more, an already stratified country like the U.S. is about to become all the more so. And there is a response growing, and I think it's going to be interesting to see. We are finally, we are seeing in this election, we have seen the Democratic Socialists taking more and more of these primaries. And what I find so interesting is because this is not just about the ultra rich, the Elon Musk, the Jeff Bezos. It's not only about them. It is also about a system that's been set up to give other people not that kind of wealth, but a nice, comfortable living. And those people tend to be politicians, consultants, political operatives. They have a lot at stake in making sure that the system as it is continues. Those are the people we're seeing right now on television and in social media, in legacy media, in as many places as we can find them, as well as on Capitol Hill, screaming about the terrifying communist takeover that is happening in the United States. Very reminiscent of what we saw a century ago, both in the U.S. and Europe, that led directly, as we know, to fascism in Europe. And in the U.S., in both places, communism actually rose quite a bit, became quite popular for the same reasons that democratic socialism is now, except that I think the big difference is that the reaction now from the right or from the conservative middle is much more extreme, and it's much more widespread. I think we're seeing what we see here is ostensible liberals, people who call themselves liberals, and they are liberal in the sense that they tend to be on the left of social issues, cultural issues, but not economic ones and not political ones, not ideological ones. And they are absolutely, I just did a podcast of my own on this. They are going absolutely ballistic. They are terrified that there will be a real fundamental shift towards progressivism in the United States, because that's really what the DS is. So they, and they're doing much like what they did in Britain less than a decade ago. We're seeing the Corbynization here in the U.S. of the DSA, of the Democratic Socialists of America, complete with charges of anti-Semitism, although those are a little worn out now. They've been overused. It's not sticking as well as they would like to conflate, this attempt to conflate support for, opposition to Israel's genocide with anti-Semitism, attempts to, sort of draw people in against the Democratic Socialists by using Israel. That's not working as well as it did against Corbyn. I think for various reasons. But and I think one of those reasons is that Corbyn was trying to address a problem within a mainstream centrist party like Labour, whereas the DSA is more insurgent in trying to transform that mainstream centrist party. But it's they have gone beyond the sort of just say socialism, and now they're actually yelling communism as if we're back in the 1970s in the Cold War. It's not working, and it's not going to work. And the reason, if you look at everything I did, I analyzed one spokesperson, Van Jones, who's a CNN spokesperson, used to be a leftist. Those are the ones they love to use. And if you look, he talks about all the reasons that DSA is winning. And he talks about how they organize well, which is true. How they have all these people going out, knocking on doors, which is true. What he doesn't talk about is the fact that they have policy proposals that people like. And they have a mayor in New York City who's actually making them work. And that represents a certain amount of hope, but I think where we are, I don't think it's wrong to say that that very hope is more likely to lead to major division, major, even, like much even more political division than we've seen in recent years. Much more likely to do that than to actually produce change, because the forces that are arrayed against progressive change in this country are not just on what we call the right, the Republican Party. They are very much in the mainstream of the Democratic Party as well.
So there is some hope in year 250. That's something.
Some, but not a lot. What we have hope for, I think, is that people are fighting back. There are ways that this can come out positively. The trick of the United States, and I think what it was very successful at, was creating a big enough, and this is where it broke from things like mercantilism and feudalism. It created a big enough middle class that was not starving, at least not starving, some living pretty comfortably, others at least getting by, that radical solutions, revolutionary solutions, aren't appealing, because you have a decent life. Revolutionary ideas are hard, they're scary, you're risking your life, literally. You're going up against the forces of the state. They will kill you. To take those chances, you have to be in a pretty bad way. The U.S. is starting to get there, but hopefully, and I think we're, the good thing, the promising thing, is that we're committed to nonviolence, which is I think what's really important. Recognizing, I don't think out of any ideological purity, I think it's just recognizing that the forces of violence are controlled by the state. So we're seeing those things. We're seeing the political movements. We'll see how far they can get. But the United States has kind of run its string out of being able to pacify people with a sort of middle-class living, because middle-class living has become incredibly difficult to sustain. Even if you can manage to do it, you're working 80 hours a week to sustain that level of life. What's the point?
Yeah, quite. And without that kind of middle-class kind of bulwark, there really isn't much standing between many people and the idea of, well, why don't we just try something quite different in terms of politics? Why don't we just try something that they're telling us is some sort of demonic plot? The way that socialism and communism are talked about in the United States is quite extreme, especially given that neither are really on the cards. We're talking about mildly more progressive policies in many cases, or more social democratic policies. Mm-hmm. I think also something to stress in all this, although I'm sure you agree, but it's something that can't be stressed enough, really, because of the tendency of liberals, I think, and that's the point, that Trump and Trumpism are really not aberrations in American political and cultural life, unfortunately, and that the deep roots go back all the way to the beginning, as you've alluded to, in the constitutional setup, in settler colonialism, in all of that violence, and ultimately it's come to a head in this form.
Yeah, I completely agree. In some ways it has unique characteristics of the 21st century, but it's simply a 21st century version of what we've seen in the United States, really, again, from the inception. The thrust of so much of the stuff, sometimes it's implied, you can see it. Sometimes it's completely unspoken, but it always comes back to the same white supremacy. It always comes back to and one of the novelties of the 21st century is that white supremacists have been willing to expand white supremacy to include the occasional person of color who will work with them. We have one of the sort of classic slave states, South Carolina, has a black senator, Tim Scott, who is as right-wing as you get. You hear there are right-wing figures who are not white here in this country. There are non-white people in this country who are wealthy. and who are part of that elite class that kind of calls the shots, but it's still overwhelmingly white. It will stay overwhelmingly white, and characteristically, it will always be white. It has to be, kind of by definition, and it is a white supremacist. And I think one of the things that the left has to come to grips with in the United States, which is what undid Bernie Sanders 10 years ago, is that we haven't found a language and a proper approach, I guess, to weld the notion that, yes, this is white supremacy, but white supremacy is in a sense synonymous with the class war. That it does transcend skin color. Skin color is the easy way that we translate it, and it works most of the time. That is exactly what you will see. But there are aspects of this American elitism that transcend race, that are and really, but there are none that I can see, at least, that transcend class. And the class war, as Marx liked to frame it, and I myself, often struggle with some of Marx's framings around these things. But the class war is not largely waged by working people, and I think that's one of the things that got so scared, that people get so scared of with communism, is that working people will actually engage in it, as opposed to simply being the victims of it, because the ruling class is always engaged in a class war. Literally always. And again, as I said, we see it around us every single day. We see it by the fact that Elon Musk is an idiot and a trillionaire. We see it by the fact that Donald Trump is an idiot and the president. We see it all over with the power of what they are calling these days Nepo babies, people who inherited their fortunes to determine the fate of the whole country, simply by virtue of their wealth. And it's not a coincidence that these guys are basically driving the country into the ground. It is something that I think people across the board are really willing to finally take on. But I do think if we want to avoid the division that we have sometimes seen, and we are seeing it right now, the attempts to divide people who are trying to make a change, it happens specifically because we have been unable to bring the class war and anti-racism into unity. And I think that is a crucial step for us to succeed. If we can do that, I think politically we have a real chance.
Yeah, absolutely, because you can't just revert back to the kind of status quo Democratic Party or the kind of 90s style neoliberal centrism. It's just not going to cut it. It can't just be a 5-minute break from the Republicans anymore.
Yeah, and I think people have finally started to realize that. And I think people, after 250 years, have finally decided we're ready to make something fundamentally different.
Which is still shorter than the British.
It is, but everything we do here in the U.S., we always take shortcuts and make it as fast as possible.
And on that hopeful note, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. This has been Globalists.